Our first presenter will be José Miguel Pérez Aparicio, okay, who will talk about the Catalan lyric theater. Welcome.
Hello? Can you hear me properly? Yes, okay. So, good afternoon, and today I will be speaking about the movement for a Catalan lyric theater. And I decided that instead of giving a lot of historical details, I will focus the oral presentation on a couple of methodological questions about my research and why my results were so different, and I was able to give a new perspective and a new look to this movement that was left out of research for a few decades. And I will mainly introduce the topic: what is the Catalan lyric theater, how it was studied until now, what am I doing differently, and I will comment some of the results that stand out the most about my research. So, what was the movement for a Catalan lyric theater? It was a nationalist movement that was given within cultural Catalanism. So that means that the Catalanism means Catalan nationalism, that's how they call themselves. And if throughout the 19th century, their topic that they aimed was language and literature, the recovery of the regional language, when modernism arrived, they became interested in other topics and other fields of arts, so they could construct national styles in music, in theater, musical theater, in painting, and curate their national schools and histories. And in this case, the movement for a Catalan lyric theater aimed to create a national genre of lyric theater that would be in Catalan language, but that would also, their ideological goal was that this genre had to represent from its dramaturgical and musical roots the Catalan identity, so it was not based on copying different genres and writing new works in Catalan language, but intrinsically it had to be Catalan and rooted to the national identity. And one of the reasons why it happened is because Catalonia at this moment, all of the theaters were playing lyric genres in different languages, and that came from other countries. So they had a lot of Spanish zarzuela, Italian opera, and French musical comedy and vaudeville. So at this point, they became afraid that their identity and language could disappear, and they were also quite worried that all of the popular classes living in the cities that came to work there due to industrialization, they will not learn the Catalan language, and that they will dissolve their identity because of these migrations to the territory. So how was this movement considered until now in historiography? They said that it was eclectic, undefined, heterogeneous, and that it was a kind of a conglomerate of different pieces without apparent similarities, without a clear line of action or style, without an articulated ideological discourse. So when they cataloged all of these pieces and tried to structure the works that they were doing and how they were aiming to reach this goal of creating a national form of lyric theater, they couldn't find defined lines of action and structure the movement. So and this is one of the reasons of why this field of research was left out of the actual research on the 80s. That's the last moment that it was researched. So that's why I decided to take it back and look at it differently with new methodologies. So I will comment some of the issues and how I addressed them. And one of the main issues was related to the press, because they understood that Catalanism at this time was a unified group with a shared criteria. So it is true that they all shared within Catalanism the same goals. They wanted to, in this case, create a national genre of lyric theater, but they were aiming to reach this goal through different paths, and they had very different ideas, and they were very plural in how this national genre should be and how the Catalan nation should be represented. So in this case, they interpreted that Catalanism was a very unified group, and they took this journal, especially this journal, Juventud, that was one of the references for cultural Catalanism, because the journal was specially made by these people within this nationalist movement. And they took the criteria shown on this journal and generalized it to analyze and understand the whole of the movement and the whole of the repertory. And we can actually see that this is the header of the first edition of the journal, and they were actually, the opinions that are shown on this journal are actually a minority within the whole movement. So in this case, Juventud, they say here that the genre for a national lyric theater should be similar to musical drama in a Wagnerian style. But when we look at the repertory, we see that most of the pieces were in short format. They were one-act pieces, and they were one of the reasons was that they wanted to compete with Spanish zarzuela and other short genres. So in order to compete with them and aim to the same public, the format was very similar, so they used the short format. And having this thinking that the criteria shown on these journals was the criteria that the authors had, they could not understand how the repertory had this short form. So they understood that either, and the general conclusion was that either the writers and composers were not technically or skilled to write 3-act dramas, or that the producer and companies didn't have enough economical support and money to produce longer plays. And that's why it was kind of disregarded, the repertory was kind of disregarded and thought that it was out of interest to research about. So what I did is, instead of looking at just these journals, I did text search on the databases of digitalized historical press. So I looked for the main key terms of Catalan lyric theater, the name of some companies and some authors, and I actually found more than 20 diaries that were, during the span of these years, were talking at the same time about these pieces that were being played on the theaters. So we find that there are a lot of very different and plural versions and reviews about these works, and that they are not only being commented by the journals that specifically treat the Catalan culture, but also on the daily news diaries. We can also find reviews and critics of these plays, and it was especially interesting to see that also religious and traditionalist journals commented a lot on this, because they were also very interested in the construction of the national identity, because they wanted religion to be considered part of the Catalan identity. So at this point, the constitution in Spain was being liberalized, so the country became non-religious officially. So their way to maintain religion within the system was associated with the national feeling. So they were very interested in also playing a part here. And we can see that they actually started a dialectical debate in the press, talking about the same pieces with very different points of view, and they actually addressed between journals, how do they dare say this about this piece that I think that represents the nation so well. So we can see that there was a lot of plurality within the movement. And when we analyze the reviews and try to structures where the ideological lines of these journals, we can see that one of the main ones are these ones. We can see Juventud, that was the journal that I mentioned before, would be on the last ones. They wanted a big operatic format or a dramatic theater based on narrative action. But we also have a lot of people interested in having a Catalan national genre that would be comical, or that will be moral according to the Catholic values, or that will be artistically very refined to especially teach the popular classes on good aesthetics, and we have a lot of different approaches on how to construct this, sharing the same goal on how to reach it. And another of the problems were how we catalog the repertory. So what had been done was a catalogation that identified the pieces and ordered them alphabetically and studied them within the complete work of the authors. And one of the things is that this movement was very intense geographically. It took place all around the region, so it reached the whole Catalan territory, but it was very short in time. So when we analyze these pieces within the complete works of the authors, we see that what they did before and did after was very different, and it's very difficult to make sense of it because they are experiments. They are trying to innovate and create something new. So in this, taking a look at it this way, they found a lot of pieces that were disconnected between them, that didn't share apparently or clearly. It was not intuitive that they were following different ideological lines. That's why they considered that the movement was not structured, like ideologically structured. So what I did, instead of taking a look at the pieces individually, I cataloged the movement by seasons and played by companies and producers. So I identified the main companies and theaters that were doing stable seasons of Catalan lyric theater, and I cataloged the seasons. And when we do it that way, we see that some pieces are left over because they are represented in other theaters out of seasons that are specifically made out of musical theater, and these ones are kind of lost. But we see that there are some theaters and companies that specifically do this kind of repertory, and each company and in each theater do have a very clear line of action on what kind of theater they want to do and what kind of genre they think that should be the national one. And some of the ones that I identified were the Teatre Líric Català, directed by Enric Morera, that we can see here in the middle. And it presented very comical genres, and they aimed to represent the regional topics of Catalan identity. But the problems that we have here, they are remarkable because they were the first one that tried to establish a complete stable season, but it only lasted 1 year. So they were sporadical on time. They changed the theaters that they were working on, and all of this created problems to reassure public and keep a public constant. But on the other side, we find a plurality of small theaters that were dedicated to the genre of musical visions. We can see here the Sala Mercè in the center of Barcelona, and we can see how it was inside. There were small theaters, and they programmed several sessions every day that combine cinematographical projections and at the end a musical vision. And we have this one in Barcelona. We also have Arts Lucis in Terrassa. We also have this Saló Gerió in Girona. So we can find a lot of them in different cities of Catalonia, and they were technically independent theaters, but we see that part of the repertory is shared between them. So even though they were not the same company or the same, they were not directed by the same producer, they shared ideological values, and they shared part of the repertory. So they were in touch between them, and they were kind of a circuit of theaters. And my part of thing, okay. And we also have the Espectacles Audicions Graner in Barcelona, that also started with musical visions, but eventually tried to conglomerate all of these different proposals and ideological lines. And these were the main promoters of the musical visions. Josep Carné, Lluís Graner, and Adrià Gual. So when we take a look at the theaters, we see that all of the ones that presented a temporal continuity, spatial continuity, and that actually designed a very particular brand that they called the musical visions, well, they were all actually defending the genre of the musical visions. So at this point, I will quickly go through the characteristics of this genre that I defined after looking for the scores and the text. And we can briefly say that they aimed in a short symbolistic format to represent visually the orally transmitted folklore. So it was very connected to the folkloristic movement. So all of the songs that had been retrieved from the rural areas and the popular legends that were transmitted orally, they intended to present them on stage in a very spectacular and great-looking staging, so they will be popular and they will be attractive for the new publics in the urban spaces. And we can quickly see some of the pictures. We can see in this one and this other one the very medievalistic ambient, the legitimation through history that Catalan was already spoken on the medieval times. We can also see a lot of religious references because they had a very conservative ideology and thought that religion was part of the Catalan identity. Also here in this one, we can, this legend was based on a Christian that was kidnapped by the Muslim Turkish and how he was rescued in a miracle by a saint. And these are my conclusions, which I will skip and leave you to read them because I am already out of time. So that was my presentation. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the presentation. We already have a question from the audience. Please, microphone.
Thank you very much. Just you had a slide that you gone over quite fast, mentioning tambor or something like this.
This one.
Yeah. What's this word tambor? I'm just asking out of curiosity.
I'll stress a drum player.
A drum player.
So
okay.
The three drum players, they are three warriors that came victorious from the war, and one of these drum players that we can see in the picture goes to the castle and asks the princess for marriage.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the audience?
Thank you for your presentation. Could you tell us something more about like even more regional representation and legends inside of the Catalan identity? Like when you showed us like a theater for from Girona, are there like also examples of this further ideology being deconstructed in a further way that it's also based even more locally, or is it really ideologically maintaining this idea of the whole Catalan identity?
They are representing Catalan folklore, but since the Catalan nationalist idea is based on language, and the Catalan language is shared by the Catalan region, the Valencian region, and the Balearic Islands. So in this case, they also take a lot of folklore from the Balearic Islands because it's also in Catalan. So at this point, they think that they are part of the same nation. And they also have a internationalist point in which they were looking very much at the German nationalists and how they were constructing, especially through Wagner, how they were constructing their national identity. So they also include some German legends and references in some cases, apart from the Catalan ones, but these are the only foreign references that they include.
And just a follow-up, short follow-up, and like since you mentioned Balearic Islands, were there like similar productions like in Mallorca? So in the language of in the dialect of the Balearic Islands?
The difference is not that noticeable because here, well, they were basing their works on folklore, but they were being very true to the original versions. So a lot of them are in Old Catalan, not the modern Catalan, and Old Catalan is very, very similar to the Catalan spoken on the Balearic Islands. So on the islands, Catalan stayed very, very true to the medieval Catalan, and it was on the peninsula it changed way much more influenced by Spanish. So in this case, they do include pieces and some poems and things written by Balearic and Mallorquin writers, but the difference is not that noticeable because also Catalan here is very similar to this dialect.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, José, for your presentation. And now, we can proceed with our next presentation. I would invite Professor Katalinić to approach. Thank you. So our next speaker is Vjera Katalinić, who will discuss member of an opera company, freelancer and impresario, so a multitasking woman from the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries.
Thank you very much. I apologize for being late. I can just repeat the words of my late professor. I came later, but this is why I will leave earlier. So this is not the topic that belongs to the fin de siècle. We will have to move a bit backwards to the second half of the 19th century, and we will deal with some specific issue of that time. Let me start with a biographical sketch of the lady which I will be talking about. Ilma Murska, or Ilma de Murska, was born in 1834, and her real name was Emma Pukšec, in the family of the military official and the noble and well-educated mother in the small military town of Ogulin. As her musical talents were, just a moment, I have to find, as her musical talents were discovered already at her age of 5, she started to get private piano lessons. When she was 16, the family moved to Zagreb. There they could afford regular theater visits, and the parents took care for consistent private professional musical education of their daughter. At first, that were private singing lessons from the Moravian orchestra musician Leopold Ružička, and soon afterwards from the Musikverein teacher Vatroslav Lichtenegger. In 1851, she married a lieutenant, Josef Eder, and soon gave birth to a son and a daughter. When her husband got a promotion in 1857 to Graz, she decided to take further lessons there with Josef Netzer, a Kapellmeister at the local estates theater and singing teacher at the conservatory, who radically improved her voice. However, after a while, she wanted to continue her training in Vienna. After many oppositions of her family to her strivings, and after she even threatened with suicide in 1860, at the age of 26, she passed the entrance exam at the Vienna Conservatory. Introducing herself as single, she changed her name into Ilma de Murske and took singing lessons with Matilde Marchesi. When Marchesi moved to Paris, Murska followed her there. Her talents were recognized soon. She was started her professional singing career in Florentine Teatro La Pergola in 1862 at the age of 28. It was in Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots as Marguerite de Valois. Thus, she entered a network of European theaters. She developed her soprano repertoire in the theaters of Italy, between Florence and Catania, in Spain, in Berlin, Budapest, Vienna, Paris, Hamburg, possibly in St. Petersburg, in Dublin and London. There she was engaged in Mapleson's company Stagioni in London at Her Majesty's Theatre in Drury Lane and Covent Garden, where she sang with Thérèse Tietjens and the other prominent singers. It seems that already in 1873 she joined the Italian opera company of the Moravian emigrant Max Marecek, an impresario who managed, among others, the Astor Place Company in New York and touring the USA, Cuba, and Mexico. He managed to engage excellent singers and conducted the American premieres of La Traviata and Don Carlos. In Philadelphia, for example, in November 1873, They performed twice on the same day. It was La Sonnambula and the next day Il Trovatore. In late October, they gave some operas in Boston as well, but the reviews were not very good. At that time, their main rival was Max Strakos with his Italian opera company, and that probably led the Marecek's undertaking to an end in 1874. It seems that Murska and Pauline Luka, her colleague and rival, at some point took over the company, and in the same year they were in Havana, Cuba, but they soon split apart. Murska continued her touring to Australia, where she remarried a musician, Alfred Anderson, who left her penniless and soon passed away. Then in 1876, she moved to New Zealand and married a certain John Hill, a musician and piano teacher of some level, but soon returned to the United States and Europe. In 1879 in London, then in Berlin, Budapest, in 1880 in Berlin, in 81, 83 in London, and soon after traveled again to the United States. Allegedly, she gave singing lessons also at the National Conservatory in New York, an institution that formally opened in 1885. However, Viennese newspaper report on her misery there, and in 1888 she returned in bad health conditions to Munich to her daughter, where she died on 14th January 1889. This is just a very brief sketch without any details about a lot of anecdotes about her. And we owe it firstly to Franjo Ksaver Kuhać, a late 19th century Croatian musicologist, and then a part of it also to Maria Barbieri, and where she presented a lot of material about various Croatian singers. Let me turn now to types of engagement, which is the central point of my investigation within the project of institutionalization of music institutions. The focal point here is to try to reconstruct the types of her engagement. Since no direct documents have been detected as yet, and her daughter, following her will, destroyed all her letters, newspapers' reports seem to be the only source. Here is just a show of her tours. Viennese theaters and audience met her regularly from 1864 to 1873. She was fully engaged there in the 1865 to 67 period, where she performed some 230 times in at least 70 different roles. Here's the list of her roles, just a selection. The opera review, signed as Caligula in the Wiener Sonn- und Montagszeitung, calls her the Koloraturgöttin, the Koloratura queen, the goddess. Long-term contracts for a fully employed singer in an opera house usually bound the singer for fixed repertoire, following the plan of the opera house and the artistic director who hired the star. Usually, these contracts gave some liberty to her to perform elsewhere as well. Besides her long-term operatic contract, occasionally she also participated in various concerts, being hired for one evening or so for an additional fee. For example, the so-called historical concerts organized by Leopold Alexander Zellner in 1867 in Vienna presented many popular performers. De Murska participated there too, along with opera singers Gabriele Kraus, Caroline Bettelheim, Gustav Walter, etc. A similar model was applied in London. The reviewer in the musical gossip of the American Art Journal, who regularly reported from the European stages, called her Mapleson's meteor singer, and that, quotes, she still picks London into ecstatic frenzy with her very original style of acting, her daring fioriture and brilliant moments of passion, end quotes. In England, she also performed at concerts as quoted in the note, quotes, on June 16, at Sydenham Palace concerts, De Murska, Enquist, Foley, Gardoni, and others from Mapleson's opera sang at 5 shilling admission fee, end quotes. Beside a contract with a theater or with an impresario, she was allowed to give guest performances when she was hired to from 4 to 6 or more appearances, such as in Budapest at the German theater, what occurred in several years later as well. Nevertheless, sometimes her contracts were exclusive. However, the stubborn star did not pay much attention to that. The newspaper reports following lines, quotes, "But the disagreement between Madame de Murske and the director of the Viennese opera did not preclude her fulfilling an engagement elsewhere. It appears that a capricious songstress had contracted with the manager of the Hamburg theater to give a series of representations. She failed in her agreement, and the result is that she is interdicted by the committee of the German Dramatic Association as kontraktbrüchig, breaking contract, refractory towards the theater of Hamburg, from appearing at any theater in fatherland," that means Austro-Hungarian Empire. "The young lady therefore must look to England, France, and Italy for her future support," end quotes. Ilme de Murske, as the majority of famous soloists, had a manager, as one can learn from the press, but sometimes she wanted to negotiate herself. Allegedly, she also sang in St. Petersburg, where negotiations for her performance in Olomouc have started. Quotes, "The negotiations with the coloratura singer Miss Ilma von Murska, which have so far failed due to the demand for the high fee of 400 guilders for one evening and the reimbursement of travel expenses for 2 people, should hopefully come to a favorable conclusion in the next few days. And so the Olomouc people will be able to enjoy to hear the singer on 2 evenings." That means on her way to St. Petersburg, end quotes. Negotiations were based on the quality of the star as well as her fame that was spread around through the theater articles. Hermann Klein, in his book Great Women Singers of My Time, devotes her a whole chapter entitled Ilma de Murska, the brilliant but eccentric, compares her with Adelina Patti and the younger Pauline Luca. He claims her outstanding voice, ranging 3 octaves in an equal strength, the easiness of her performance, exquisite technique in coloraturas, as well as her engaged acting. She mostly enjoyed the roles of unreal female characters, fairies or other mystic and distorted figures, where the Queen of the Night in Mozart's Magic Flute seems to be one of her highlights. The quality of the performance combined with the eccentricity was undoubtedly a winning combination already since the late 18th century, and the press adored it and cherished it with compliments. An extremely demanding task could be performing within the itinerant opera company. On the beginning of her career, she was hired by an unknown impresario, that was her first long-term contract, who dragged his company from the north to the south of Italy without any repose, so that it is said that after that, Murska returned to her parents to Zagreb to recover, and that was her last visit to her homeland. The strong pressure of such companies was partially caused by the new and improved means of transportation, better roads, and above all, the railway network that enabled the regular performances almost every day, with traveling by train in between. Starting already in the first decades of the 19th century, the first railroads, after being constructed in England, conquered the continent, France and Belgium, Italy, a bit later in Germany, and then since 1860 in Croatian lands as well, and the transatlantic states as well. The first railroad on the Western Hemisphere was constructed in Cuba in 1837 by Spanish constructors. The new mobility affected many changes in the social sphere, music production included. For example, in 1848, Chopin could reach Edinburgh from London in 12 hours by train. The frequently used water transport became faster with the development of the steamers, so that British companies organized regular transatlantic steamer transport already from 1830s. The technical elements were improving rapidly so that the dynamics of transportation grew from year to year. Murska will later use this transportation means with much skill, both to cross Europe and within the United States, as well as to cross the ocean. In London, with Mapleson Opera Company, Murska was a star, the train service excellent, and his dynamics of the staging obviously suited her. At the beginning, it was similar with the Marecek's company in the USA. However, when he bankrupted, she decided to take over the company together with Pauline Luca, who was at that time in German opera company. Wiener Salonblatt gives further information on her adventurous trips. Quotes, "In Havana, two beautiful Austrian nightingales now live, namely Mrs. Pauline Luca and Mrs. Ilma von Murska, or as the latter prefers to hear, Miss Ilma von Murska. When the great opera and prima donna fuss in New York broke out over Marecek's company, the above-mentioned ladies went to Cuba as female impresarie and dragged the entire opera company with them on the specially rented steamer. At first, the story went well, but after a few weeks, the case took a big turn." End quotes. With a lot of passion, the company got divided into two parts. Quotes, "One part supported the blonde Croatian girl, the other one the black-eyed Viennese." End quotes. Shortly, both singers had problems with the court, and the journal cited the proverb, "Stay home and earn your living honestly," because the success years of European singers in the United States was already gone. The taking over of the company by some of the performers was not unusual when the former impresario ran out of money or ran away with money. Such examples can be found even in the history of the Zagreb theater in the first half of the 19th century. However, the responsibilities of an impresario were manifold. The artistic, arranging the repertoire, choice of performers, etc., and organizational, ensuring the adequate performing place, transport of people and the equipment, lodging, regular payment, etc., but also a firm hand to manage the crew. Impresari gave a lot of information on their troubles in their autobiographies, Mapleson and Marecek included. Obviously, two ladies from Vienna were not able to fulfill it, and the company got apart. Yet, Ilma de Murska continued her trips on her own. And let me come to some conclusions. In many aspects, Ilma Murska was just one of many sopranos who toured around Europe and the world. She entered the network of European theaters, partly only as guest performer and partly as a permanent or a long-term engaged member of a theater. However, as soon as she entered the Mapleson Company, the itinerant theater troupes and their networks became familiar to her too. When arriving to the American continent, she participated in Marecek's troupe, and later she did not fear to try to organize her own network. Besides, Murska had to live through typical female legal problems, varying from country to country, i.e., not being allowed to possess and manage her finances by herself, what led to her financial breakdown in Australia. That topic is only mentioned here and requires a thorough investigation. Still, the challenges of a restless way of living seemed that suited her, as the eccentricity and way of acting and singing taught by her teacher, Matilde Maresi, suited her character and made her special. Namely, already at the first exam in Vienna, the critic commented the Marchese's class, quotes, "Everything is prepared for brilliance, everything calculated for effect. The external effect should replace the inner efficiency, and the trick succeeds with most listeners. For the Marchese's girls' school, voice is the first requirement, uprightness the next, routine and the external glamour the third," end quotes. The German press accused her to lead a gypsy life, what was observed as not ladylike at all at that time. However, many other singers adopted her model and way of living. To some extent, it was adopted by the Croatian start of the next generation, Milka Ternina. Yet, the circumstances have changed so that she did not have to suffer of same accusations as Ilma de Murska. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have time for one or two very short questions. Are there any from the audience? Please.
Vjera, can you comment something on the position of a woman as a businesswoman, an independent businesswoman, on the example Ilma de Murska gave us?
Yes, well, that is what happened. She earned a lot of money, and that was followed by the newspapers as well, the press. And they reported how much has Pauline Luca earned, how much Ilma de Murska, and so on. But her problem was that she married that person in Australia who actually took her money and bequested that to his family. So when he died, she was penniless. And that was the problem, that she was not able to manage her own income. And that, according to the press, it came to the court, but we don't know the outcome. And then she was forced to go to another tour to earn some money. Then she moved to New Zealand, to Dundee, and then she remarried, probably out of same reasons. It is not known, did she divorce her first husband, or did she just leave the family? So the legal aspect is completely unclear, because also it is said that her husband from Zagreb came to Munich when she died there to collect her ashes, but it seems that she wanted to be cremated, and she was cremated in Gotha, in the first crematorium in Europe, also where Berta von Suttner and some other important personalities are. So this is not clear, but this is why I said that it's work in progress. I have to see the legal aspect of a woman dealing with her finances. I know that in Croatia was quite a traditional, let's say, issue that usually, especially in 18th century, we know that women remarried when their husband died, remarried a year after. That was a year for mourning, and then next year they remarried. And it was because of that they couldn't deal with their own income and their possessions. We know that, for example, Anica Bošković had a guardian that was, after the death of Ruđer Bošković, her brother, that was Luka Sorgo, who had to help her manage her estates. So, well, that's a work in progress anyway.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the audience? Well, if not, then I'll thank once again. And I will introduce our next speaker, who will present online. It's Darina Svobodova, who will talk about a military bandmaster, Julius Fučík, and his estate in the National Museum, Czech Museum of Music in Prague.
Hello, good afternoon from Prague. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
You can talk. We can hear you well.
This year has seen the 150th anniversary of the birth of the Czech composer and military bandmaster Julius Fučík. He won worldwide fame mainly as the March King, whose most famous composition is clearly the March Entrance of the Gladiators. However, Fučík's oeuvre as a composer is far more diverse. Besides marches, waltzes, and overtures, he also composed songs, sacred music, symphonic poems, and works of musical theater. Today, the estate of this important representative of European military musical culture is kept at the National Museum, Czech Museum of Music in Prague. Julius Fučík was born on the 18th of July 1872 in Prague as the eldest son of the family of a craftsman operating a small business. He already exhibited musical talent as a child, playing violin and piano. Although his father wanted him to become a glove maker, his desire to study music was fulfilled. He graduated from the Prague Conservatory as a bassoonist and timpanist. In 1890, with some of his classmates, he became a pupil in Antonín Dvořák's composition class, and that had a major influence on his own composing. He spent his 3-year period of military service with the band of the 49th Infantry Regiment based in the Austrian town Krems an der Donau, where the bandmaster was the famous Austrian composer Josef Franz Wagner. With that ensemble, Fučík began writing instrumentations for wind band and symphony orchestra, and later he reaped the benefits that experience in his activities as a bandmaster. Upon returning from his military service, Fučík worked as a bassoonist in the orchestra of Prague's New German Theatre, then in the exhibition orchestra of the National Ethnographic Exhibition under the baton of Karel Kovařovic. After the exhibition, he joined the orchestra of the Zagreb Municipal Theatre. Working in the theatre did not suit him, however, so after just half a year, he took the position of town music director in a nearby Sisak. He worked there successfully for 2 years, also serving as the church music director and the conductor of 2 choirs. In 1897, he applied for the vacant position of bandmaster of the 86th Infantry Regiment in Sarajevo, and he won the job at just 25 years of age. Fučík was very content in Sarajevo. Social life in the city was busy. Military officers organized soirees for which Fučík composed the musical accompaniment. As a military bandmaster, he began composing more music, and his March Sarajevo and the Waltz Dream Ideals are especially well known. While in Sarajevo, Fučík also composed his best-known composition, March Entrance of the Gladiators. The score is dated October 17, 1899. In 1900, the band of the 86th Infantry Regiment was redeployed to Budapest, and that was advantageous for Fučík. He was more closely in contact with publishers, and he was in touch with Vienna and Prague. During his 9 years there, he wrote most of his compositions, including some of his best-known music, such as a Florentine March, the Overture Marinarella, and a polka for bassoon titled The Old Grumbler. In some compositions, he employed elements of Hungarian folk music, and a few of his pieces even have Hungarian titles. He did not break off his contacts with Prague, however, and he even collaborated with the Czech Philharmonic, which performed his suite live. Because of unfavorable circumstances, the performance of the suite was not a success, and that dissuaded Fučík from further cooperation with the orchestra. In 1909, the 86th Infantry Regiment was redeployed to distant Sabatka, now Subotica in Serbia. This change annoyed Fučík, and he lasted less than a year in Sabatka, where he was far removed from all the action. However, while there he did manage to write more famous pieces like the Waltz the Ballerinas. In 1910, the position of bandmaster of the 92nd Infantry Regiment in Terezín became vacant. Fučík again won the job, and he returned to Bohemia. There he married his girlfriend Christina, but their only son Ferdinand died just a month after his birth. The band went on frequent trips to play in the spa towns of northwestern Bohemia, and in 1912 they even went on a successful tour to Berlin. In Terezín, Fučík composed more famous works, including the overture Miramare. After 3 years, Fučík decided to leave the military and to spend more time composing. For his life as a civilian, Fučík chose Berlin, where he had experienced great success, unlike in Prague. His brother Rudolf was also living there. Soon after arriving in 1913, he founded his own ensemble, the Prager Tonkünstler Orchestra. The orchestra consisted entirely of Czech musicians and played Czech music. It was active until the beginning of the First World War, when it fell apart. After that, Fučík founded the publishing firm Tempo Verlag, but he only managed to publish a single composition, the song Native Land. He began to work on an opera, and he wrote an operetta, but it was never performed. Also dating from this period is the funeral march Pax Vobis, which Fučík wrote in reaction to news from the battlefield. In 1915, Fučík suffered from a flare-up of an old leg injury, and his health worsened gradually. Treatment did not bring improvement. After a long period of suffering, he died on the 26th of September 1916 at just 44 years of age. In accordance with his wishes, he was buried in Prague at the Vinohrady Cemetery, where his father and son had already been buried. The Fučík family's tomb is still preserved there. Over his lifetime, Julius Fučík composed about 400 works. Some of the compositions, especially from his late period, remained in the form of sketches, and we know many of his early compositions only by their titles because, as he himself said, he destroyed them as an act of self-censorship while living in Berlin. After Julius Fučík's death, his wife returned to her native Styria, where she took the things he had left behind, including musical manuscripts. Later, his estate was partially moved to Bohemia, and as the result of various court decisions, the estate was divided into as many as 4 parts during the interwar period. After the death of Fučík's siblings, the Antonín Dvořák Society inherited the entire estate. In 1984, the National Museum took possession of the estate for the Antonín Dvořák Museum. Then it was transferred within the National Museum to the Department of Music History of the Czech Museum of Music. From 1995 to 2002, an expert inventory of the collection was made. In 2007, the museum acquired additional objects from the family's belongings, and these were subsequently processed as an addendum to the inventory. The Julius Fučík collection is relatively large, containing over 2,900 items. And of that total, the Fučík estate itself contains nearly 1,250 inventory numbers. In addition, the collection contains related materials and materials from the estate of family members. Julius Fučík actual estate is divided into several parts: personal documents, correspondence, non-musical manuscripts, music manuscripts and printed music, printed material, iconography and memorabilia that belonged to him. Personal documents in the estate are represented by a diploma from the Prague Conservatory, which was acquired as an addendum to the estate. The extensive correspondence mainly documents his written contact with family members. A large portion consists of postcards from the cities where Fučík was working, and some of the pictures on them are drawn in his own hand. The correspondence also includes several letters to publishers. Among the manuscripts, other than music, the most interesting are Fučík's two private diaries from 1893 to 1908. The most important part of the collection consists of musical manuscripts and printed specimens of Fučík's composition, which represent more than half of the entire estate. Besides Fučík's own works, there are also a few compositions by other composers that he arranged, copied, or simply owned. Of interest are the notebooks of music theory from the period of Fučík's studies at the conservatory, which he decorated beautifully with drawings. The music in his estates consists mostly of manuscripts, and most of those are Julius Fučík's autographs. The estate can be said to contain an almost complete collection of Fučík's autograph scores, with the majority of his preserved compositions from the years between 1888 and 1916. Although Julius Fučík is mainly known as a composer of marches, the music in his estate is much more diverse. While marches come first with respect to the number of items, songs are surprisingly in second place, only then followed by dances, overtures, and other genres. Fučík's works of musical drama are entirely unfamiliar. The estate contains two versions of an opera titled Destiny, the second of which is unfinished, and a complete operetta titled The Court Official. From the operetta titled In the Bremen Cellar, which was performed in Sarajevo in 1900, only the finale was survived. Among his orchestral compositions, the cycle of 4 symphonic poems titled Austria's Honor and Glory is uniquely important. At the time when what was written, the 3rd symphonic poem, The Battle of Kustoca, won several prizes. Of his works in the concerto genre, it is worth mentioning his early concertino for bassoon. Fučík wrote the work at the conservatory and dedicated it to his teacher Ludwig Milde. There is a relatively large quantity of chamber music, with the largest share being duos for violin and piano. There are important trios for 2 clarinets and bassoon, which Fučík wrote for his trio in Prague. Fučík wrote piano music mainly in his youth, including 2 compositions for piano 4 hands. There are numerous songs which Fučík wrote in both Czech and German. Some were issued in print, but today they are practically unknown. Especially while living in Sisak, Fučík composed choruses, mostly with text in Croatian. Overtures of some of Fučík's best-known compositions. In the estate, one finds Marinarella, Miramare, and St. Hubertus, as well as the less familiar Ballet Overture and one of the least, Seaguard. Of his dances, the most famous are waltzes. The estate contains all of the well-known titles, such as the Ballerinas, Danube Legends, Dream Ideals, From the Banks of the Danube, and Winter Storms. As one would expect, marches account for the largest category of music in the estate. Fučík composed about 100 marches, 3/4 of them while serving in the military. We find most of Fučík's marches in his estate, both in manuscript versions and in many cases in the form of printed editions. Among the oldest are the autograph scores of the marches Entrance of the Gladiators, Danubia, originally Laban, Sarajevo, Bosnian Patrol, and Triglav. Dating from the time when he lived in Budapest are the autographs of the marches Kinizsi, Under the Admiral's Flag, Fantastic March, The Jolly Village Blacksmiths, Salve Imperator, and above all the Florentine March. The last two places where Fučík served in the military are represented by the autographs of the marches Uncle Teddy, the Victorious Sword, and the Slav Guard. Even after leaving the military, Fučík did not stop writing marches. Autographs of the March Gigantic and of the funeral march Pax Vobis date from his time in Berlin. The titles of some compositions were changed by the composer or by the publisher, and this largely involved his marches. Besides the Florentine March, originally La Rosa di Toscana, other examples of changed titles are the Dumb Corner, published as Bosanska Zora, the March Remembrance of Trent, originally titled Faithful Tyrol, and the Royal Grenadiers, which was renamed The Sounds of Fanfares. The printed materials in the collection are of great interest, including concert programs, announcements of the publications of compositions by Fučík, and tributes. In the estate, there are 2 notebooks containing past newspaper clippings and programs. One notebook was made by Fučík himself, and the other was made by his brother Rudolf. Besides musical talent, Julius Fučík also has had ability as a visual artist. His artworks in the estate include several drawings, 2 sketchbooks, and designs for the covers of edition of his own compositions. The iconography in the estate includes a large set of photographs with portraits of Julius Fučík, musical ensembles that he conducted, family members, and other persons. The
Darina,
final
please,
important part of Julius Fučík's estates consists.
Darina, please excuse me, we are running out of time. Can you bring your presentation to a conclusion, please?
Yes. The entire inventory can be accessed on the website of the National Museum in Prague. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any questions? We have time for one brief question.
Thanks for your presentation. I don't know if you know that his compositions were also on records, early on records in by Edison Bell Pencala and then later companies, and performed by Zagreb Military Band, and so several of marches and the waltzers that you mentioned. So my question is, did you deal with his discography, and within that, if you did, what's the position of his composition? How much they are included in the early supraphone and ultraphone record labels?
Yes, recordings are of many of the pieces. But the complete discography is now isn't ready.
Mm-hmm. You have no any insights into how much he was included in early, let's say, supraphone from late 1940s, because I mean from Fučík we could then learn more about the relationship between Zagreb-based company and Prague-based supraphone, because we know that the relationship existed, but not much more about like what kind of collaboration it took. So through Julius Fučík, we could perhaps learn more if you have some information.
I have not information about it. I apologize.
Well, thank you once again. And now we'll hear our last presenter in this session, Timur Sijarić, who will talk about the start of a theater company in central Switzerland. Please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, organization team, for allowing me to present my paper, The Start of the Operetta Success, Operetta Productions as Forms of Collective Identity Formation in the 20th Century in Stadttheater Sursee, conducted currently at the Lucerne School of Music. My project activity started on September 1st this year, and since I took over the project 3 months ago, it is my intention here to present not only the outlines and planned outcomes of this 2-year project, but also to show you the first insights that we have collected on the selected operetta productions I see that we're already quite over time, but I would try to keep it short, but I would also like really to hear your opinions, inputs, and discuss with you either following this presentation or in the next 2 days. The premise of today's paper is the desideratum within a relatively well-researched studies on localization and effects of theater, opera, and even operetta venues within a context of urban communities, like for instance in Operatic State by Ruth Benson, and more recently in Operatic Geographies, edited by Suzanne Aspden. The majority of these studies, however, take the hotspots of cultural and social political activities, being somewhat myopic in regard to production houses generally and sometimes even derogatory considered as the province. Exactly that is, in my opinion, not only one of the key features, but also a badge of honor, I would call it at this stage, of theater and operetta house existing for more than 2 centuries in historically rich, but by all means provincial, heart of central Switzerland. I'm sorry. I usually dislike showing maps, but unless you're from the region or have a particular interest in the history of early Swiss Confederacy and the Battle of Sempach, for instance, this might be of some help. I said this little, I try to highlight it. It's not well visible, but this red dot is where Sursee and Stadttheater Sursee are. Founded on the December 14, 1800 as the Theater- und Freundschaftsgesellschaft, and celebrated in a couple of days its 222nd birthday. Stadttheater Sursee is one of the oldest theater societies in Switzerland, still active today. On the slide, you may see a part of the text from the invitation to residents of Sursee to the founding session of the society, which calls for strengthening the cultural and social bonds within the community. My favorite bit is the last part of the sentence, and the old generation kind of low-key complaining about the lack of zeal within the youth and the need to reinforce it. What we can consider the founding document of the society is one of the testaments of the already flourishing social involvement of the social classes, namely the artisanal and so-called bourgeoisie. How this transformation of the theater and later inclusion of operetta in the 20th century happened can be seen, among other things, in a strongly changing conception of these social classes, as seen in the studies by Tenfeld and Vjera from 1994, as well as more recently in Bude 2010. The conditions that made this impressive integration of performance of the Suicide Theater possibly lie moreover in the socially effective Swiss culture of cultural societies and companies since the 19th century, as does the diversity of theater landscape that is unparalleled in Europe, as analyzed by Kotte, 1995. During the 19th century and well into the 20th century, the society, which is now known as Stadttheater Sursee, changed locations and contexts. At the same time, looked for a permanent and preferably new venue, exemplified here by the plans for a grandiose new building outside of town, which however were never realized. The society found its renaissance in the reopening of the theater at the current location in the year 1927, please mark the date, in what is now amply named Theaterstraße 5. This marked the beginning of a new period for the theater and the reason why I'm taking part in this project, namely that of the operetta. This introduction of the musical theater in form of operetta, parallel to the reopening of theater, marks a milestone in the existence of the venue and is lauded today in the theater official history as the start of the operetta success, which I used in my title. This start of the operetta achievement happened with the first performance in 1928, so 1 year after the reopening of the De Fidele Bauer, one of the greatest successes in Sursee's theater history, and has been on the program of the Sursee Theater a total of 6 times to date, as said, first time in 1928, then 1929, 1932, 1947, 1978, 1992, excuse me. And the analysis of these productions forms one of the key points in the project. I'll use this occasion also to foray into this specific operetta here, as the Fidele Baua, or the Merry Farmer in English, exists as a dual mirroring of the community, a way to attract the audiences from town and especially region to a show of self-respect, but also a self-ridicule of the rural and the pastoral and the employment of the community itself in the production. In other words, both the performance and the audiences, and of course performers, are making fun of themselves. The last significant milestone was the renovation and the modernization of the building in the year 2000, following the 200th anniversary of the society. Today in Sursee, which did not grow that much, a small town in Lucerne Canton, which has a population of 10,000, one encounters a regional cultural focal point, however, in which the contemporary trends and the tradition still kind of stay in balance. In line with this balance, the Stadttheater Sursee and its performances have always been and still are negotiating new affiliations between the urban communities and rural communities and their ways of thinking. This is the most recent pick that I made. The fact that it's the operetta that has played a leading role, I would say, in Sursee's theater culture since its renaissance in 1920s may seem strange at the first glance, but in view of the peculiarities of the genre, and I hope also to be able to show why exactly this happens. My preliminary fact is and belief that no other genre of musical theater in this context, and especially in the 20th century, could withstand this tension between the rurality and urbanity, between conservatism and social criticism, between artistic aspirations and idyllic, which hits as smoothly as operetta. So coming back to the investigation, the main project, and I think I'm gonna skip here a tiny bit, is to ascertain the formation of communal identities on a municipal, regional, and national level with an in-depth investigation of Sursee's operetta culture of the 20th century based on the hitherto unanalyzed textual, visual, and audiovisual archival material. On the basis of these records from the theater and town archives, the perspective of the operetta productions of the 20th century serves as the postulate of the creation, recreation, and the change of said identities of the social classes, as it is admittedly oriented to the already formulated demands that grasp the connection between the theater life and society, as seen in the following quote. This showcases the Sursee's operetta life of the 20th century in regard to the three main foci of this specific key aspects. Social-political history of Stadttheater Sursee and its reception. Second, the aspects of institutional history. And third, selected productions and or performances. I can gladly come back to them in the discussion, but I'm going to just gloss over here. What I cannot skip is exactly the dissemination of this project, and kind of also giving back to the community, the Sursee community that is also partially funding this project. And in addition to the conventional means of academic dissemination, like right here, we, from the project, intend to present the results of the study to a wider audience in form of digital documentation accessible via internet. On the one hand, we are having the abridged versions of the research, which will be presented there, and the other selected image and audio documents on the operetta tradition at the Stadttheater, make these project results accessible in accordance with a theater experience. The various linking possibilities between text parts as well as sound and image elements also allow each user an individual journey through the world of operetta in Sursee. The start of this journey historically, and the productions I would like to focus on in the closing part of my paper today, form the first 10 years of the theater operetta activities. In addition to, there we go. In addition to already presented the Fidele Bauer, one can notice a tendency in delivering either relatively new works like Die Goldene Meisterin or in Weißen Rössel, or generally popular works reflecting the current interests of the audiences and town's inhabitants. On this note, I have to say that although there seems to be a correlation in presenting in Weißenrüssel in 1933 and Alt-Wien in 1938 as signs of protest towards the National Socialist political gains in Germany and later in annexed Austria, this hasn't been identified by now. On the other hand, however, major events clearly resonate in the wider context of this cultural politics in the region, as seen as in the formation of Luzerner Musikfestwochen from 1938, which are considered inaugurated by Arturo Toscanini's performances following his refusal to participate in Salzburg following the so-called Anschluss in the same year. Whereas the intentions and the implementation program are, as you can see, still work in progress, the tendencies behind the productions are easily recognized. Here we see a clear supremacy of German-speaking, mostly something that we will consider Viennese operetta today, with exceptions to the rule appearing towards the end of the 20th century, but still conducted in German. Especially interesting is the occasion of starting an operetta program against the background of the genres fading away in popularity and over presence, like Moritz Czaki puts in a double-intended closing on his book, well, standard work on Viennese operetta. This lamenting on the historization of the genre can be seen in this quote, and as well as the discussion on the controversial terms of Silver Age or post-operetta eras in the first half of the 20th century are mirrored in the rising interest exactly for the form of entertainment deemed relevant to the society that is, at least partially, represented in them. Moreover, the two operettas taken as an example of diminishing influence of the genre itself by the author in his last chapter, in Weißenrüssel, for instance, in Gräfin Marica, appear in the program I selected for this paper, and even in the later productions. As it can be deduced for the internal documents and works reception, these kinds of productions were pushed into foreground by the town and theater councils and were a significant factor in education and cultural building process. Most significant aspect of it, not just for this paper in the context of the conference, but in a general way of communal cultural participation, is the actual participation and sense of music organizing and, of course, music making. Preserved music materials in the archives of the Stadttheater Sursee indicate arrangements, changes, and joint efforts in rehearsing and performing music, in this specific case, a musical insert or intermezzo during the performance of Alt-Wien in 1938. Not only the content of operetta productions as forms of collective identity formation, but their execution and artistic fullness relative to the size and capabilities of the Stadttheater Sursee demonstrate the significance of music in society and even society in music. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So, do we have any questions from the audience for our last speaker in this session? If not, I'll have only one brief question. I don't know if I overheard the information maybe, or you didn't tell us anything about that. You said that this small town has 10,000 inhabitants. How many places are there in the auditory of this theater?
There are around 300, and after the modernization, they also made it up to 500. So it's like even from its inception, like in the 1920s, they always counted on a lot of guests coming from the outside.
Do you know how wide an area is attracted? How wide is the area of attraction? Where do people come from to go to the shows in the theater? How far they travel to attend the performances?
Well, that's an excellent question, because like in most programs, you can see that there is basically instructions where to or how to come to theater. And which trains to catch, and basically almost like an invitation also to different car sharing at the time or carriage sharing possibilities. So they were definitely trying to mobilize not just the towns, inhabitants, but also people from the mountains. I mean, Switzerland is, everything is in the mountain, right? But they were constantly working exactly on this way to present José as a tiny bit out there, but also something that is very easily accessible. And considering that this is already from the very start, as I said, I'm now presenting only 10 years and up until 1938, it's impressive. Because it's truly a way how to kind of market this the town itself, but also to show exactly this this inclusion of it, that it is a small town still, but it's a town, and exactly this way of the class structure is exactly what's interesting in this context. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you very much, and thank everybody for your attention. I don't know if we'll start accurately, but don't go too far away from us for the next session, which was supposed to start in 3 minutes.
Yeah, I also did my best. I also did my best to kind of shorten it up a tiny bit.